let's face it, ASROCK is not exactly the very first brand you have in mind when it comes to gaming or enthusiastically driven motherboards, and ASROCK knows this and wants to change it. Just like MSI did in 2018, they're trying to rethink the whole approach of their motherboard manufacturing, changing lines, trying to add more features, and being more present on the market. And today's review absolutely, completely illustrate that. The Z390 EXTREME4, despite some similarities with its predecessor, is a totally different animal. It's ASROCK best-selling motherboard, and it comes in direct competition with the Prime Z390A from Asus and the Z390 Tomahawk from MSI, both of which I did review a few weeks ago, and you should take a look at. I think it was that side of the screen. So needless to say, ASROCK really cannot afford to get this wrong. It does start by giving us 10 CPU-centric phases, which is usually reserved to much more expensive and higher-end motherboards. So definitely a lot of aggressivity coming from ASROCK. So what else? What else can we expect? And let me show you something. I'm coming back. What can we expect from a company which adds a carton postcard with their high-tech motherboard? That is a question. ASROCK is dead serious about their comeback, and so they did come up with a motherboard which is quite well balanced between first-time builder and enthusiastically driven features. It comes in an ATX motherboard form factor, meaning 24.4 cm wide for 30.5 cm long. It is powered by the usual LGA1151 CPU socket, which can support both the 8th and 9th generation of Intel Core processors. And to power even the most demanding and expensive CPUs, ASROCK has equipped its VRM with 10 50 amps CPU dedicated phases. 10. I would like to remind you that usually at that price range or even at that segment of the market, motherboard comes with no more than 8 phases and even sometimes 4x4 parallel phases. So having 10 phases is something which is reserved at, I don't know, $200 and higher up. So they really did go with big artillery, and it works beautifully. This motherboard can easily run and overclock the mammoth of a CPU i9 9900K, and it does so without too much heat. I did notice a little bit of heat after a few hours of CPU stress test, but not enough to thermo throttle it. So yeah, that's what ASROCK needed to nail, so to differentiate itself on the market, and they did. So kudos for a major kudos to ASROCK for this. The heatsinks are rather thick and large. They do a good job at radiating away all that extra heat, and despite, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit of overheating on the 8-core processor, it does a stellar job at keeping thermo throttling at bay. Memory-wise, we are dealing with the usual dual-channel DIMM slots, which can support up to 64GB of DDR4 RAM, overclockable up to 4.3 GHz. And staying in the memories, the EXTREME4 can support up to 2 M.2 solid-state drive memory modules, which can swap data up to 32 gigabit per second thanks to the Z390 Optane ready chipset. But note that with this kind of transfer rate, obviously thermo throttling is common, and that is why we have a thermo padded heat shield for our longer, therefore hotter M.2 solid-state drive memory stick. Export-wise, we have 6 third-generation PCI Expresses, 3 of them single slot, single speed, 3 16 slots with different speeds. Not that only the closest one to the CPU can transfer data up to 16 bus speed, and therefore this is where you'd want your video card to be for optimal performances. If you're going for a 2 SLI GPU configuration, these PCI Expresses will be sharing bandwidths and deliver respectively 8 and 8 bus speed. And finally, if you're going for an improbable 3-way video card setup, which by the way I do not recommend for this particular motherboard, you will find yourself in an 8x4x4 bus speed configuration. Note that since these two PCI Expresses are the one most likely to bear the heavy weight of our GPUs, they have been also metallically reinforced, which is always a good thing to see. Back eye-wise, let me first note the absence of an integrated heat shield, which I do regret, specifically when you go for first-time builder. It's a nice touch, doesn't cost much to the company, and some things I'd like to see in the next iteration of the Extreme4 motherboard. I also want to underline that ASROCK has always been big in the legacy compatibility market, meaning that we do have a mouse, keyboard, PS2 plug, as well as a VGA output. So if anything else does fail, you always have a way to connect with your BIOS or with your motherboard in general. Other than that, we are starting from the left to 3.1 5 gigabit USB plugs, 4 3.1 second generation 10 gigabit plug, including a Type-C, a display port, as well as an HDMI video output, a gigabit Intel LAN, and a rather premium 7.1 channel audio module. Now, this is where the Wi-Fi module used to sit in older iteration of the Extreme4, but no more. Now our motherboard has a M.2 Wi-Fi module connector right here. It will allow you to upgrade connectivity rather quickly and inexpensively and take full advantage of the 802.11 AC Wi-Fi nested in the Z390 chipset. SATA-wise, we do not have 6, but 8 third-generation SATA blocks, which can all individually transfer data up to 6 gigabit per second each, and which can be configured in RAID 0, 1, 5, or 10. Front panel connector-wise, we have 2 second-generation 480 megabit USB connectors, 2 3.1 first-generation 5 gigabit USB connectors, and 1 3.1 second-generation Type-C, which has been capped up to 5 gigabit alone. And I do suspect that they usually come with a 10 gigabit speed, but I think that has been reduced by 2 because of the number of SATA blocks. Instead of having 6, we have 8, and I think that they had to cut bandwidth somewhere to make that move. Finally, and to my satisfaction, we have a full-fledged Thunderbolt 3 connector, just in the case you'd want to expand your board connectivity any further. So there we have it. We just looked at the general aspect of the motherboard, and as I said, usually in my reviews, already we have something very solid, the VRMs and so forth, but it's only half of the story. Where I was equally surprised is the support of custom water cooling that ASROCK has focused onto this motherboard, and a paradoxical one, because we only have 5 nested PWM fan connectors, but 4 of which can fully support dedicated water pumps, and that is something I have not seen on many motherboards, if any. So very surprising, and it does indicate that this board can fully support a dual loop custom water cooling configuration. And where it's paradoxical is the fact that if you do take 2 connectors for 2 water pumps, you'll find yourself with only 3 connectors for fans, and I didn't see any hub connection anywhere. So basically you're gonna have to add some splitters, and that'll allow you to add another 4 fans per connector on top of the nested one, giving you about 15 fans, which is more than enough, but that's something you need to keep in mind if you want to go that direction with that motherboard. And of course, this would not be an enthusiastic motherboard with a bunch of RGB options, and I'll start by saying we have 3 addressable RGB strips nested on the motherboard itself. One under the I/O roof, a second one under the sound I/O shield, and a final and third one under our chipset thermo shield. And if that was not enough, we have no less than 3 RGB polychrome connectors, 2 right here and 1 addressable right there. Again, very happy to see an addressable RGB connector. This is not something you usually find at that price range with this kind of entry motherboards. But most importantly, it also means that if you so wish for, your build will probably be able to be spotted on the dark side of the moon. In conclusion, the ASROCK Z390 Extreme4 will cost you about $160 before taxes, and that's about 25 to 30 bucks cheaper than its equivalency in its competition, and that's always a red flag. But in this case, Dude, you know, I think that they've done a pretty decent job at surprising me and at surprising the market. They're very low key. They're not as big as Asus or MSI or Gigabyte in getting out there and scream their new products and reach the users out there. And that's a pity because this is an impressive motherboard. It is. It feels premium. It looks amazing. There's a better aesthetic all over. Simpler line, but of course the star of this review is a VRM. 10 CPU-centric phases, which will solidly overclock anything you throw at it. And this is one motherboard at $160, which can really well handle the i9 9900K, an 8-core processor. Of course, there's a couple of things I did not really love. The fact that we did not have any integrated I/O shield, as I mentioned earlier, and a bit of a paradox, which put me a little bit in a difficulty to explain. The fact that we only have 5 nested fan connectors and that 4 of them can be used as water pumps. I would have loved to see 7, at least 7 connectors with 4 water pumps would have been great, but these are no deal breakers. ASROCK wanted to do a big bang and they absolutely succeeded. This is definitely a big move coming from ASROCK. And I think that we're gonna see more of them much more often. If I was a first-time builder, this is where my money would want to be, no question asked. This is as close as you can get as of a future-proof motherboard. Even if you had a 10-core processor released with a 9th generation Intel Core, 10 phases will be able to handle it. So that's very surprising at this price range. I keep repeating myself. And if I was a more enthusiastically driven user, yeah, that motherboard will do the trick just fine for a bit of a cheaper price tag. So that's a win-win situation.